This video is going to explain the mechanics of the research game Galactic Escape. Galactic Escape's gameplay loop has 4 repeating phases: move, choose, roll, and consequence. Before play begins, the game completes the setup. The player's avatar is a spaceship. This spaceship has 4 hidden attributes: weapons, shields, sensors, and engines. At the beginning of the game, each of those attributes is set at level 2. At the beginning of the gameplay loop, the player must move to a new position. Each location is presented as a colored cube. Each color indicates the attribute that will be challenged. The player selects which point on the map that they next want to visit by clicking on the location. At this point, a short animation plays, and the player teleports to the new location. The player is then presented the challenge to overcome and 3 possible approaches to overcome the challenge. These approaches are color-coded by their risk levels. Green choices are low risk but low reward. Yellow is medium risk and reward, and red is a high risk and reward. When the player selects an approach, the game moves to the next stage and rolls the dice. The die roll and the consequences have been heavily inspired by John Harper's Blades in the Dark. The game rolls a number of d6 equal to the attribute level that was challenged. The game takes the highest shown die as the result. In the event that an attribute is reduced to 0, the game will instead roll 2d6 and take the lowest shown result. In the current play example, the challenge addresses sensors, and the player's current sensors level is 2. This means that the game would roll a 2d6. Let's assume that the resulting die show a 3 and a 6. The result of the roll would then be the highest showing result, or a 6. All of this mechanical dice rolling happens in the background. The player is only told the final result of the roll. The roll results are split into 3 ranges. On a 0 to 3, the player has failed the challenge. On a 4 or 5, the player has succeeded, but at a cost. On a 6, the player has succeeded fully, and may receive a bonus. Regardless of the chosen approach, if the player fails a roll, they must repeat the challenge. Also, once the player has rolled the dice, they must wait a short while before continuing. The time that they must wait, and the other consequences, depend on the approach that the player selected. Let's start with the green approach. The green approach has a 5-second waiting period, and the consequences only affect the current challenge. On a partial success, 2.5 seconds are added to the recharge time. On a full success, there are no other consequences. Let's look at an example of this. Let's say the player has chosen the green option, challenging an attribute that's at level 2. The game will roll 2d6 and gets a result of 3 and 5. The roll result is therefore 5, the highest shown number. This is a partial success, so the player must wait a total of 7.5 seconds before moving on as normal. On a yellow approach, the waiting period is only 3.5 seconds, and the consequences only affect the next roll. This is referred to in tabletop terminology as a plus or minus 1 forwards. On a failure or partial success, the player rolls 1 less die than normal on the next roll. On a full success, the player rolls 1 more die than normal on the next roll. Let's look at an example of how this works. Let's say that the player has chosen the yellow option on a challenge with attribute level 1. The game rolls a single 6-sided die, or 1d6, and the result is a 2. This is a failure, so the player must attempt the challenge again after a 3.5 second wait. The player also receives a minus 1 forwards. Let's assume that the player chooses the yellow option again. Because the challenge is being repeated, their attribute is still at level 1. However, because of the player's minus 1 forwards, the roll happens as though the attribute was at a level 0. The game rolls 2d6 and takes the lowest score. If the result is a 4 and a 6, the game takes the 4. This is a partial success. This means that the player will clear the challenge after a 3.5 second wait. Also, because the minus 1 forwards was only for the next roll, it no longer applies. However, because the player only partially succeeded, they once again have a minus 1 forwards on their next roll. On a red approach, the waiting period is only 2.5 seconds, and the consequences permanently affect the challenged attribute. Let's look at how this works. Let's say that the player has selected a red option on a challenge that addresses weapons, and their current weapons attribute is 2. The game rolls a 2 and a 5, and therefore the result is 5. The player has succeeded in the challenge and can proceed after 2.5 seconds. However, their weapons attribute is now at level 1 for the rest of the game, or until any other red consequences occur. Before we end, let's look at this in action. The player begins the game with all 4 attributes at 2. This is shown for clarity. The player begins gameplay by selecting the next warp point, a short animation plays, and they arrive at the location. The text tells the player that this challenge addresses engines, currently at level 2. The player then selects the approach. In this example, they've chosen the yellow approach. In the background, the game rolls 2d6. The text tells them that they have fully succeeded. This will mean that they have +1 forwards. Once the player has waited the designated amount, they begin the loop again by choosing their next destination. A short animation plays, and they arrive at the location. The text again tells the player that this challenge addresses engines. The player's current engine level is 2, and the +1 forwards gives them an effective level of 3. The player once again has selected the yellow approach. The game now rolls 3d6, and the +1 forward is cleared. The text suggests that the player has partially succeeded. This means that they can move on, but will suffer a -1 penalty on their next roll. The player then continues repeating this gameplay loop.